Good evening. Welcome to African Drums. I'm Elsie Harry, and I'm glad you've joined me this evening. Cuffy 250 will hold its annual State of the African Guyanese Forum on Sunday, August 7th, at the Critchlow Labour College Auditorium. The forum, which brings together the African Guyanese community to deliberate on their condition, will explore the following theme: African Guyanese self-realization, challenges for the next 50 years. For the next few weeks, African Drums will be addressing some of the sub-themes of the forum, and we start this week with a general discussion of the forum's theme and its objectives. With me are two members of the Cuffy 250 committee, Mr. Vincent Alexander and Dr. David Hinds. Gentlemen, welcome to African Drums.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, and your usual faces on the show, so you need no real introduction, right? Okay, so let's start with both of you giving the audience a sense of what the Cuffy 250 committee is and what kind of work the organization has been doing. Do you want to begin, David?
Well, yes, we are an organization dedicated towards the upliftment, if you will, of the African Guyanese community. So in that sense, we are an ethnic-specific organization. And our major objective is really to engage the African Guyanese community in a constant discussion and conversation about where it is. Different organizations do different things, and we are concerned mainly with mobilizing the community and quote-unquote educating the community about its history, its culture, to talk about its current challenges, and to try to, with the aid of the community, come up with solutions insofar as that is possible to those problems and challenges. So in that sense, we are an African Guyanese advocacy organization, and we have been doing that kind of work over the last 4 years, going into communities, talking to people, engaging in discussion about culture, about history, about topical issues and so forth. We've been working with children also. Every year we have what we call emancipation camps, and we've held them in 3 locations: Stanley Town on the West Bank, Good Intent Sisters also on the West Bank, and Melanie Damishana. And it's where we bring children together during the August holidays for a couple of weeks, and engage them in discussion and education about African Guyanese history, black culture, black invention, African Guyanese and education and entrepreneurship and all those kinds of things. So that's the kind of work we've been doing, and this forum is our 4th forum. We started it 4 years ago when we held the first one. We call it the State of the African Guyanese Society. And we use the opportunity to bring African Guyanese from across the country in one place to engage in discussion, and then hopefully out of that discussion for them to go back to their communities and to really implement some of the things that we have discussed. We discussed the conference, the forum.
Okay, so the theme chosen for this year is African Guyanese self-realization, challenges for the next 50 years. Can we talk about why this theme was chosen and why it's important to have this theme at the forum?
As before you go to that, I would just like to add a wee bit to what David said.
Sure.
David in the main spoke to the origins and the kind of work that the committee does. I think it would be useful though to let the public know that over time, the Cuffy 250 has been working towards structuring itself, formalizing its existence and things like that. And in that regard, we've gotten to the point where we're now a registered group under the Friendly Societies Act. And I think it's useful for the public to know that we've done that, and that given that that required the draft of the Constitution, which we drafted, and which was accepted by the membership. And as a consequence, we took it to the Ministry of Social Protection, got our registration. And as a follow-up to the process, what we have since done is to hold an election.
Okay.
And now have officers who are elected under the Constitution. And so it's useful for the public to know that even as we do the work which we're doing, that we've also been doing work in terms of strengthening the organization and formalizing the organization and structuring the organization so that we have the kind of framework that puts us in a better position to do what we have been doing and will continue to do.
Okay, thanks, Vincent. Let's talk about the theme of the forum now. Why did we choose this specific theme for the forum?
Well, the country celebrated its 50th anniversary of independence this year. The African community is an integral part of the country, and I think that any community, like the country at large, will want to make an assessment of where it is at, what has happened for it and for the country over this period of 50 years. And not only to make that assessment, but against the background of where we're at, having made the assessment, to determine where we want to go and how we're going to get there. And so this forum, I think, is going to focus essentially on that assessment over the last 50 years of the state of the African Guyanese, what has happened for, not happened for them, what point they've arrived at, and more importantly, here on, what do we do to enhance the condition of the African Guyanese as a part of the wider Guyanese society.
Okay. Do you have
If I
something to
may
add?
add, Elsie, the self-realization aspect of the theme is deliberate. The African Guyanese community has had a long tradition of self-activity, whether it was on the slave plantation where the enslaved had to fend for themselves, they had to defend themselves, they had to create their own culture, create their own language, define themselves within the context of subjugation. And we often do not speak about that a lot because, the brutality of slavery is so overpowering that sometimes we forget that our foreparents overcame that brutality, and in the process of overcoming that brutality, we really created self-sustaining institutions and cultures and so forth. And so the notion of doing for self is very much part of the tradition, and sometimes that gets lost, or there is this myth that African Guyanese people really don't do much for ourselves and we always depend on handouts and all that kind of stuff and so forth. And so we wanted to highlight that tradition in the community of looking out for ourselves and constantly looking to see what we can do about our community. The very formation of our villages is in itself one of the greatest acts of self-activity and self-emancipation that our people have engaged in, and we wanted to keep that tradition. And so therefore, in this time of, we are part of a larger country, as Vincent said, part of a larger nation, and of course, as people belong to a country, we are expected to contribute to that country, and we are also expected that that country should, in certain regards, protect our liberties, our human rights, facilitate economic development, and so on and so forth. We understand that. But we do believe that at this particular point, that each community has a responsibility to really take control and take responsibility. I don't like the word responsibility, I take back responsibility. To take control for its own forward movement. That, the government is there and the government has to look after all citizens. But that as a community, we have some space and a responsibility. Again, I go to responsibility. But we have that duty to really define who we are. And part of the African self-definition is about realizing our own humanity, which was taken away by slavery. I mean, the challenge to our humanity. And so we are constantly in this project of realizing ourselves culturally, realizing ourselves economically, realizing ourselves politically, because if we as a community are able to define and redefine ourselves and really discover our full potential, Guyana would be a better place, and all ethnic groups should be doing that. And so we wanted to make sure that this year we talk about African self-realization, especially within the context of the fact that the vast majority of African Guyanese last year voted for the government in power. And we feel that there is a temptation to say, well, now our government is in power, we throw back and wait. And we wanted to say, well, no, the government has a responsibility to all of us as citizens, but we as a community have a responsibility to really lift our voices, all right, and take initiatives of our own to really harness all of our energies and to lift our community and to also demand of the larger society to contribute in that regard.
Okay, let us talk about the organization of the forum and its objectives.
Well, as David said, this is going to be the fourth forum. It is by and large being organized by Cuffy 250. There's a specific objective of mobilizing the wider Guyanese African community to come to have exactly the discussion that we have referred to, that is the discussion of what has been our faith over the last 50 years and how into the future we can accelerate this process of self-realization. So essentially it's a forum that will have presentations and discussions that are supposed to lend to, on one hand, enlightenment. On the other hand, it's supposed to lend to some resolve by the people who are present, and to leave, in a sense, with a resolution from the standpoint of being enlightened, to knowing what kind of work one needs to go back into the community to do in this process of self-realization. You know, whenever we talk about Cuffy 250, we really talk about self-actualization. That's kind of the mantra which we talk about. And so all that we do is towards that process of self-actualization. And so the conference is intended to be another moment along that continuum when some direction and focus is given to this process of self-actualization.
And let me add to that, Elsie. This year, we want to do something a little bit different this year. We want to try to get almost all of the African Guyanese communities to have some presence at the forum. And so what we intend to do this year is to make contact with community organizations in all of the communities and to formally invite them to send the representatives to the forum. If we may engage in a slight self-criticism, the past forums have been generally weighted in terms of people from Georgetown and its environs, and because this is where it and we, you know, our country is relatively large, so you don't just wake up one morning in Eversham or Firish and say, you know, come into a forum in Georgetown in the same way that you could do it if you live in Plaisance or in the same way you don't wake up at Dartmouth on the Quarantine Coast or Quarantine Essequibo Coast or Queenstown and say, you know, come into Georgia. You want to make preparations to that. And so what we want to do is to contact these community organizations and to formally invite them and to ask that they send representatives to this discussion so that the discussion is broadened beyond Georgetown. We have been collecting contacts of these organizations, but if persons are viewing this program and you have an organization, you want to come to this forum, please make contact with Coffee 250. I know you're going to give that contact information during the course of the program, but we want almost all of the communities to be part of this forum. We want it to be a very broad-based discussion, so that when we come out of the forum, we come out with something that has the blessings of the broad cross-section of the African Guyanese community.
Okay, under the broad heading of self-realization, what are some of the specific issues that will be addressed that members of the public, for example, should be interested in?
Well, one of the things we want to talk about this year is the village economy. This is a challenge that was thrown out by the president, who was the keynote speaker last year, and he was the keynote speaker the year before. He wasn't president then. But he threw out the challenge last year of revitalization of the village economy as one of the means of reinvigorating the African Guyanese community, and in general the Guyanese community. So we want to make the revitalization of the village economy one of the points of discussion at the forum. So that's one. A second issue we want to talk about is the issue of reparations. We've been having this discussion about reparations over the last 3 or 4 years. It's picking up. But what we want to do at the forum is to take that discussion to another level. That is, we want to hear from the African Guyanese community and have a discussion about what reparations could look like. Now, I think we have made the point about, we've made the case for reparations. Every African Guyanese instinctively knows what that case is. But the Reparations Committee and organizations like ours have reinforced that case, for reparations. So we want to, at the forum, begin to talk in practical ways about what reparations could be and should be. We also want to talk about procurement, right, Vincent? We said the whole business of procurement, one of the sore points in the African Guyanese community is that we feel that the community is not had an equal share of things like contracts and so forth that are given out by the state. And so we want to talk about that and talk about how, as a community, we can make the case for the democratization of the procurement process. We know that they're doing that at the national level, but this is an issue that impacts directly on the community, because if more contracts come into the community, and we're not saying all contracts, because we feel contracts should go to all communities, Amerindian communities, East Indian communities, African communities, and other communities. But we feel that as the African Guyanese community, we should press our case for the democratization of the procurement process, because we feel that if the process is democratized, then it would benefit our community. So we're not discussing bringing more contracts to the black community. What we're discussing is a democratization of the process, and to make proposals as to how we can go about that process so that the community can benefit. I'm not sure, Vincent, I forgot one or two.
Actually, I'd like to kind of build on what David said, starting off with the whole question of the villagization. All along we're talking about the African Guyanese community. And in talking about the African Guyanese community, I think we can, on one hand, talk about the villages in their own right. We can talk about the community at large. And we can talk about the African individual. So I think the focus in terms of whatever we do has to take those three levels into consideration. To a large extent, there is a spatial identification of African Guyanese in villages. And so as we talk about the communities, we have to emphasize that spatial of identity, which is in the form of the villages and has an origin in the village movement, and how we can go back to those villages as one of the places where the process of self-actualization should be taking place in a communal way, at the community level. And then from there we move on to the more general things, and I think the procurement one falls into the more general things as to how African Guyanese, people of the African Guyanese community can benefit from the national largesse, because there is the view that we have been disadvantaged over the years, and that the system needs to be corrected to give us an equal opportunity to things which have not been available to us. There are other groups in the society that tend to make a case for things they said have not been available to them, without reference to sometimes the historical circumstances. And there are also things which have not been available to the African Guyanese community, and procurement is one of those areas. The African Guyanese community involvement in business, for example. And so we want to see how we can have a discussion that can allow us to come to the table, the national table, with proposals, not to discriminate against anyone, but to give African Guyanese an opportunity as they may not have had in the past. And thirdly, the whole question of African Guyanese as individuals. We've talked about the question of identity, the way in which they need to recognize their own being, their individual potential, and to recognize at the individual level what opportunities are available to them, so that they can pursue the process of individual self-actualization, which adds up, in a sense, if it takes place, to communal self-actualization.
And if I may, a quick minute, Elsie, we want to concentrate especially this year on the question of the economic condition of African Guyanese. Something we've talked about over and over and over and over again, but this year we really want to zero in on it, because we're living in a world in which, whether we like it or not, the whole business of private sector becomes the engine of economies around the world. And so we want to talk about how African Guyanese can become part of the entrepreneurial class. And we see entrepreneurship not in capitalist terms. We see entrepreneurship in communal terms, right? In terms of driving driving home the point that development is not just about foreign direct investment, but it's also about investment in people in their communities, investment in small businesses, all right? And so that we feel that African Guyanese are better placed to take advantage if those initiatives are taken. Take, for example, the case of the vendors. It's been a lot in the news and so forth. And we want to talk about vending as an important aspect of the African Guyanese contribution to the larger economy, and as a form of sustenance, economic sustenance in the community. And I think the fact that it's now in the news gives us an opportunity to talk about how do we formalize what is really in effect a part of what they call the informal sector. And so therefore, if we were to bring those vendors into the formal sector, right, it would become an institutional way of lifting the African Guyanese community. So, we want to talk about all of those things. And we feel that, in the next period, that should be an important aspect of the work in the African Guyanese community, and to urge organizations and even the government to recognize that this is one of the ways of lifting the community. And in the process of lifting the community, you're lifting the society. And of course, Vincent talked about culture, which is always an important plank. One of the topics we want to discuss is how can African Guyanese continue to contribute towards social cohesion in Guyana. It's now the buzzword and so forth. So we want to engage it. How we as a community can contribute to the whole process of social cohesion, and that if social cohesion, or if we can achieve a higher level of social cohesion, how that can in turn impact positively on the African Guyanese community.
You mentioned social cohesion. Let's talk about what social cohesion means for the Guyanese society, because the Guyanese society is plural.
Right.
In some other societies, it's one ethnic group. So they see social cohesion as having one culture. What does social cohesion mean in the Guyanese context?
I think you're quite right in identifying social cohesion around the theme of plurality. In society, there are various aspects of plurality. You can have ethnic plurality, you can have religious plurality, you can have class plurality. Cohesion really speaks to the question of how in one place, in one society, you can on one hand recognize that plurality, and on the other hand get the various sectors to work together as a whole, not to the detriment of the individual parts. So how do you get, for example, a society where there is mutual respect across the spectrum for the various ethnic groups? How do you get a society where people are allowed to practice their culture, their religion, but at the same time, at the national level, to have some element of oneness in terms of, for the national good, adopting certain values and certain policies that are conducive to the maintenance of the plurality in a cohesive manner.
Yeah, Vincent is quite correct. I mean, it's about, we cannot talk about social cohesion outside of the context of diversity. I think sometimes we talk about social cohesion in the absence of diversity. Social cohesion, as you pose the question, becomes this cohesive thing, becomes a substitute for diversity. Now, we in Coffee 250 feel that social cohesion has to be driven by that diversity. And as Vincent says, how do you use that diversity to derive from it a certain kind of sameness? So that is a sameness that arises out of diversity, and the sameness includes the diversity. I was last night, for example, I went to a benefit concert for Henry Rodney, who, as we know, is not well, and some of his colleagues are raising resources so that he can go overseas for medical treatment. And I was struck last night by an Indian Guyanese artist who had the mainly African Guyanese audience rolling by making jokes about black people. No, and I say that to say that popular culture, for example, all right, becomes one of the ways, one of the mediums through which we can, in a sense, begin to talk to each other and about each other in their presence. You know, one of the things in ethnically divided societies that each ethnic group is in its own little corner, talking about itself and talking about the other, and we seldom have the ethnic groups speaking to each other in their presence and in the open space. And so I happen to believe that if we can begin to talk about the areas of intersection in the community, you know, cricket, you know, sports in general, popular culture, the arts, and so on. Perhaps those are the areas that we can begin to talk about. And we know that African Guyanese have contributed tremendously to popular culture in this country. And so that's one of the areas we want to really explore. How is it as a community, the African Guyanese section of the population can help to push this crucial area? Because whether we like it or not, we are not going nowhere as a country. First of all, if we don't recognize the individual strengths of the ethnic groups, and secondly, if we're not able to marry those strengths and to create something that all of us can subscribe to. Vincent likes to say that what we need to do is to create institutions in which all our ethnic groups can participate and work together. And if you're able to do that, perhaps we will be able to see a different level of, you know, social cohesion and ethnic solidarity.
Okay, let's talk about some of the structural challenges to African Guyanese self-realization.
When one talks about these structural challenges, there are a number of areas that will have to be addressed. I think one of the first and a very major area is the state of the African family. The family could be considered to be the basic unit in any community, in any society, and the way in which that family is structured or not structured impacts significantly on the people of that particular community. So I think that we've got to look to this question of the African Guyanese family. It's not a matter of merely of the family. There are a lot of other factors that impinge upon what the family is and how the family succeeds. And the economic is also one of the elements in relation to this question of the family. If you take, for example, the way in which you have a lot of single-parent families, and females essentially being the single parent, and the nature of their employment being largely in the security sector, then you see a situation where the mother really does not have the time, not to mention the income to look after that family. And so one has to look at that kind of a dilemma. One has to look at the role of the male in the family, whether it's a formal marriage or it's not a formal marriage, the role of the male, because every element should be a contributing factor to the work of the family. And so the question of the role of our males, and we know that there are issues with the role that the males play today. The whole question of consciousness in relation to how does one address the whole process of growth and maturity. How does one decide when to become sexually active, and that impacts too on the kinds of families that are emerging. Yeah. It impacts on the young people being away from school when in fact they should be in the school system, still furthering their education. So family is one critical element that needs to be addressed, but we need to emphasize as we address the family, there are a number of other elements which contribute to the state of the family. I think also there's a big question about, we talked earlier in very general terms about opportunities. How is our society structured to provide people with opportunities, particularly people who have been disadvantaged in the past? African Guyanese have been disadvantaged in more than one way. We've been disadvantaged, I would say, psychologically, because in our endeavors in the past, the village movement, the attempt to become involved in farming, and the way in which the villages were flooded and people had to leave those lands, psyching them out of farming and looking upon farming as something that has not and cannot offer them a way forward. Now, how do we pay specific attention as a society that has done that? The people who originally farmed and in fact bought villages to do so, how do we now redress that wrong in terms of the kind of attention that is paid to those villages from the standpoint of their infrastructure, particularly the drainage and the irrigation infrastructure, which was what was used against them? How do we now show them that we are prepared to provide those infrastructures so that they can in fact go back to farming? How are we prepared from the educational standpoint, not only to provide infrastructure, but to show them the worth in getting involved in the activity and giving them, in a sense, the guarantee that there will be no repetition of what happened in the past? And that's again another psychological factor that you have to get involved in when you're dealing with them. There are some, I would say, some dysfunctionalities that may have arisen given the historical circumstances that one would also have to address, and very often the issue of African Guyanese and the way in which, even when they create wealth, sometimes there's a tendency for early gratification that impacts on the growth and development of business. And people tend to say, well, African Guyanese can't do business, but if one checks the society, a lot of the businesses that have flourished, the African Guyanese are the pioneers of those businesses. But given what has happened historically to them, in a sense, gratification seemed to be an element of what they considered the liberation. But that sometimes is the detriment of the sustainability of the activity in which they were involved. And so we've also got to be working with the African Guyanese community for them to recognize the whole question of sustainability from an economic perspective, and the whole question of sustainability from a familial perspective as well, where one generation really establishes a base upon which another generation should build. It's the tendency sometimes when people rely largely on education as the instrument for mobility, is that if I educate my children, then I've done my job, right? And I'm not knocking education, but I'm saying if one also establishes, in addition to education, an economic base that is there to be inherited, then you are really providing a foundation for the African Guyanese family and for the African Guyanese community to be able to progress, rather than everyone having to start back from the standpoint, I'm educated and I know it be my own base.
Just to add to what Vincent said, I want to zero in on the question of poverty. It's a structural problem, it's a historical problem in Guyana, in the larger Caribbean, that we have not really solved. There have been periods in our history, both especially our recent history, when we made concerted attempts to deal with the question of poverty. And of course, in the African Guyanese community, the poverty is especially pronounced, given the fact of the imbalance in opportunities to really break out of poverty. And to give you a sense of what I mean by the structural the structural challenges in terms of poverty. In the late 1980s, the world moved towards what they call structural adjustment, imposition of structural adjustment on societies like ours, where our attempts at breaking out of poverty were deemed by the IMF and the World Bank and the world economy as, experimentation that were not sustainable and so forth. And so that we needed to do it differently. We needed to shrink government spending. And what did government spend on? Government spent on employing poor people in the public service. They spent on education for poor people, healthcare. So if you're talking about shrinking, you're talking about shrinking those things. Take the public service. If you shrink the public service, as we were forced to do by these dictates of the IMF, it directly affected the African Guyanese community more than any other community, because 80% or more of the public service was made up of African Guyanese. So when you say retrench workers from the government, it's African Guyanese. And we don't have a private sector that is strong enough and large enough, and we don't have African Guyanese enough in the private sector to absorb those people who are let go by the government. We don't have a sector. So what you do, what these structural policies did, is that it devastated the African Guyanese community. Increase in unemployment, and once you have increase in unemployment, it affects your ability to send your children to school. It leads to all kind of dysfunction in the community. So we can trace, even recent history, all right, of how the very structure of the economy affected negatively the African Guyanese community. We're not saying it didn't affect other communities, but when you begin to talk about opening up possibilities and using the private sector, the entrepreneurial class and so on, as the engine of growth, African Guyanese community is a disadvantage, because we are not represented in the entrepreneurial class, in the merchant class, as other ethnic groups. And so that whole structural adjustment thing had a really negative effect on our community. And so 30 years later, it is about time that we start to talk about fighting back against that and fighting back, not just by shouting at somebody, but to develop mechanisms within the African Guyanese community to cope with what has become an economic reality. So that we have to do two things. We have to continue to push back against structural adjustment and globalization and so forth, and using the private sector as the sole engine of the economy. We have to push back against that. But we also have to find means to survive. Right? So it's about resistance and survival. And that's something that we want to talk about at this forum in the African Guyanese community, that we have to stand up of African Guyanese people and say, nobody's going to do this for us. Right? We need allies, but we've got to lead the way in terms of dictating our own survival.
Okay, so
I want to add to what David has said, particularly in this question of the economic situation. The whole question of privatization and the private sector being the engine of growth is not something peculiar to Guyana. And so people may ask the question, well, what are you really saying? But I think that all of these things have got to be contextualized. I don't think the experience of the African Guyanese in Barbados is necessarily the same.
Right.
Though they have issues there in terms of the structures as well, and the roles of the settlers in terms of the economy. But I don't think Barbados and Jamaica probably is a better example of the way in which the private sector's growth does not impact negatively on the African community as it would in Guyana, because the African community is not positioned in that private sector. And so to take the private sector as the way in which you want to develop the country and the economy without specific reference to the state of the African Guyanese, and without providing for a repositioning the African Guyanese in relation to the private sector, really is to further embed the poverty-stricken state of a large part of the African Guyanese community. So we have to be very strategic on this question of the private sector's engine of growth, and to ensure that there are policies, that guides that engine, that allows for passengers who are not on board to be able to board.
Okay, I'm sure some viewers that are watching the program right now would consider this special treatment for the African Guyanese community, while other ethnic groups would have, in their mind, had to come out and work for what they have and do things for themselves. How do you respond to that criticism?
That's very simple. One can respond in various ways. I mean, we have seen the experience of America, for example, where they've recognized that one has to deal with disadvantaged peoples, and that the peoples being disadvantaged is not a function of them not making an effort. It is a societal evolution, and sometimes even an imposition that has caused them to be disadvantaged, and therefore they're entitled to an opportunity to redress what has historically happened to them. We live in a country where, for example, we have pursued policies and if not pursued, articulated policies about how we deal with the disadvantaged Amerindians. So this is not something about African Guyanese. This is a principle about people who have historically been disadvantaged in one way or the other, and how do you seek to address or redress that disadvantaged state that they have been placed in. And we're talking about people who were, first of all, brought and made into slaves and not allowed to chart their own destiny, and the exploitation that empowered and made others wealthy, so that on our backs these things have happened. So, and here's where, for example, the question of reparation comes in. They undoubtedly owe us, based on what historically has been imposed upon us. The village movement, what happened in terms of flooding of those villages? Economic sabotage. Where is the compensation for that sabotage? We see in the modern society the rain falls, nature intervenes, and there's compensation. And we have suffered from human, intentional, and vindictive compensation. sabotage? Where is the compensation for that? So I don't see it at all as a question of discriminating. It's a question of redressing. It's a question of putting policies in place for equalization, where there were policies for quite the opposite in the past. It's owed to us.
Okay, so
the Walter Rodney thesis of the relationship between development and underdevelopment. You know, groups in societies are rich because other groups are poor. Whether we look at it from an ethnic standpoint or we look at it from a social class standpoint, the wealth of some is as a result of the denial of wealth of others. And you know, Walter Rodney's seminal contribution to our understanding of these societies that we live in. And I think that we constantly have to talk about these things and educate the general population, because it's very easy to say that, you know what I mean? Somebody inherits the wealth of their parents or their grandparents. Now they say, well, you know, I have worked hard, you know, and if you there don't have wealth that you inherit from your grandfather, something is pathologically wrong with you, and so forth. And so when you appeal to the umpires in the society to say what we want is a level playing field and what we want is fair treatment, it's seen as asking for special treatment. Well, you know, if you start the race later than others have started the race, at some point you've got to catch up, you know, and the way you catch up is not by telling the others in the race to stop and wait. Is that you have to find mechanisms and put them in place so that the society can be equalized. It's equality, right? It's when African Guyanese or poor people in general ask for opportunities, what they're really asking for is to equalize the society. That's all they're asking for. They're not asking for special treatment. They're saying, but if you are all the way in front there and I'm at the back here and I'm asking, how can I come catch up with you so that, you know, there can be equality. So it's not about special treatment, it's about equality.
okay, so we have just about 10 minutes left, and I have two issues I want you to discuss. One, the forum has been going on for 3 years. What physical improvement or mental improvement, whatever improvement, have you seen in the state of the African Guyanese since this forum has been held for 3 years?
I'm glad that you posed the question that way, to identify two forms of improvement, mental and physical improvement. The work that Cuffy 250 does, in the main, the impact would be, the direct impact would be the mental improvement, so to speak. We could put in other terms, spiritual improvement and psychological improvement, but let's take the broad term, the mental improvement. I think the work that Cuffy 250 does, in the main, that is where the impact is visible as a direct result of what we're doing. Getting people to think differently, getting people to do differently, getting people to know differently. Now, if people do differently, think differently and know differently, then you'll have different material results. So people might not attach the material results to what happened at our forum, but certainly it's an indirect consequence of what they would have done coming out of the forum in terms of redressing the way in which they see life, the way in which they treat life, the way in which they make decisions about life. And those decisions are eventually going to be real hard material decisions with impact in material life.
If nothing else, Elsie, you know, to get our people to begin to come out of this state of fear of talking about being black or talking about being African, I think we have made some inroads in that. I mean, people are today speaking very openly and constructively about, you know, race, about their blackness, about their heritage, and I think it's a healthy, very healthy development, and we, I think, have contributed. Every Sunday night at 8 o'clock, you sit here and you interview people, mostly African Guyanese, mostly about African Guyanese issues and so forth. And, the program has built up its own viewership, right? And its own small niche in terms of dealing with the question of the decriminalization of blackness, so to speak. That when you say I am black, you're not saying that I am anti-Indian or anti-Amerindian. All you're saying is that I am part of this Guyanese mosaic. I'm a legitimate part. I am different in terms of pigmentation, different in terms of culture, but that's my strength, and I bring it to the table and make Guyana this place that we all hope that will continue to be a home for all of us, that we can say that, dear Guyana, this is our country. This country belongs to all of us.
Okay, final issue that I want to discuss. Some observers have said that at these forums, we hold these forums, and then there is never any follow-up or any practical outcomes. Is this true? And how does you two as members of Cuffy 250 answer to this criticism? Is the forum a talk shop?
Well, first of all, we have to go back to an understanding of the role of Cuffy 250 and the forum as one of the instruments of Cuffy 250. I think we have said it ad nauseum now that Cuffy 250 is involved largely in advocacy. Our role is to attempt to educate people, to inform people, and to motivate people. And so you're not necessarily going to see Cuffy 250 following up by going to a village and doing a project that's a material project. But certainly coming out of the education and the information, we expect people to go back and to get involved in self-development activities. And in that regard, we can say, yes, we have seen places where people have gone back and been involved in these activities, not necessarily under the rubric of Cuffy 250. I think we would like to point, for example, to Stanley Town as one of the good examples of the impact of Cuffy 250. The people in Stanley Town, for example, have for the last 2 years, without any external stimuli, been engaged in celebrating independence. And they have a very good activity there. People turn out, large numbers, their own cultural activities. Now, the fact that they have that feeds back into what people are going to be doing. Next year we want to be involved, so we're going to get involved culturally and things like that. Out of inspiration that they would have acquired from interaction with Cuffy 250. They also have started empowerment sessions in terms of classes for children, for young people in welding, things like that. So you're seeing the impact from that perspective.
A lesson center, they have a lesson center.
So they have a lesson center. So yes, though these things may not have Cuffy 250 written out there, the people who've gone back into those communities were motivated by the work of Cuffy 250 and are now going to the second level in terms of moving from mere advocacy, which is the base that we are establishing, to actualization. They're actually doing things that shows an understanding of where they're at and where they need to go.
Okay.
I mean, I understand the frustration, Elsie, sometimes when people are frustrated, they feel that, we've talked too much and so forth. But, the very people are going to tell you, if you don't go there in the village to talk, they would ask you, man, what you all saying about what's going on? And so forth. So, you know, I mean, there are two sides of the coin with that. I think there's an appreciation out there for discussion. There's an appreciation for advocacy. People meet us all the time and tell us thanks for advocating on a program like this on their behalf and so forth. So yes, we feel that it's not a waste of time, and we don't feel that the majority of people feel that you know, constructive discussion and discourse it's a waste of time. But we're always conscious that there can sometimes be people who just chat and then do not present any constructive path out of difficulties. And so we in Coffee 250 try to do that at certainly at the level of the intellect and so on, to begin to say, well, this is a way in which we can consider to break ourselves out of this vicious cycle, or to find a way around this thing and so forth. And I think we inspire people, and if we inspire people as Vincent say, and they can go back to their communities and begin to do things and so forth, I think the talk is well worth it.
Okay.
Just to say,
okay,
we have a fault line in a sense when we say they go back to their communities, because we also go to their communities. Mm-hmm. And an example I want to give, I don't think there's any group in this country that has done more work in communities, in educating people about local government.
Local government, yes.
We have done probably the most work and have inspired people. And the fact that they inspired and they became councillors will now impact on their involvement in local governance. So that there is sufficient evidence to suggest that Coffee 250 has been achieving, though there is much more to be done.
Okay, thank you. This brings us to the end of the program. Thank you, gentlemen, for being on African Drums.
Thank you very much, Elsie.
Okay, viewers, thank you for staying with me. This has been African Drums, the television organ of the Coffee 250 Committee, an organization dedicated to the empowerment of the African Guyanese community through education and to the encouragement of self-activity. I just want to remind you and invite you out to our forum on August 7th at the Critchlow Labour College Auditorium, and you'll get more information about the speakers and the time of the forum as the date draws closer. Please make a special effort to attend the forum. Remember, like our Facebook page, it's Coffee 250. Also subscribe to our YouTube channel, Coffee 250. Send us an email so that we can hear your questions and concerns, coffee250gy@gmail.com. I'm Elsie Harry. Please join me next time.